Estate project. The video for the longer presentation will be linked in here or will be in the description. What if you had the chance to help Noah build the ark? What if you could stand beside Moses and Aaron as they led our people out of Egypt? Would you say yes? Would you act? Well, this mission is just like that. The Yahusha Estate is being built here in Ghana as a refuge, a safe place for the awakening remnant around the world. This is more than land. It's obedience, it's prophecy, it's preparation. So pray, share, and if Yahuwah leads you, give. Let's build this place together, and may Yahuwah bless us all.
Greetings, family. Welcome back to the African Exodus show. My name is Sister Tierney here to you with a new video. Before we get started with today's video, very quickly, if you desire to be connected with this platform outside of YouTube, best way to do so is to add yourself to my Telegram channel. On there, I post anytime that I upload a new video. If there's any thoughts I need to share, that's also the place that I can post it. In addition, if you do feel led to support this channel, you can do so a number of ways. You can do so through Cashapp. Also, you can do so through PayPal, and the PayPal link is in the description. You can also add yourself to my Patreon, where I share all of the PDFs and any articles that I share inside of the presentation. I'll also upload it to Patreon for your own studies. So today we're going to be talking about more about the curses on Yasharel, the children of Yasharel. But I want us to start talking more methodically about these individual curses as they get called out. So let's just read from one curse that I want to focus on today. And this is regarding what I would say is the manifestation of a lot of issues as far as the families, as far as the structure of the men and the women and the children being according to Yah's order and according to his way. The man who was refined and very delicate among you will be hostile toward his brother, towards the wife he cherishes, and toward the rest of his children who are left, so that he will not give even one of them any of the flesh of his children which he will eat, since he has nothing else left during the siege and the hardship by which your enemy will oppress you in all your towns. And it says, the refined and delicate woman among you who would not venture to set the sole of her foot on the ground because of her delicateness and tenderness will be hostile toward the husband she cherishes and toward her son and daughter and toward her afterbirth that comes from between her legs and toward her children whom she gives birth, because she will eat them secretly for lack of anything else during the siege and the hardship with which your enemy will oppress you in your towns. So I said very recently, this particular prophecy inside of Deuteronomy 28, because at this point we know that the curses were actually put on Yasharel because the people did not obey Yah. So it's no longer just a possible curse. It's actually a prophecy that's been fulfilled. And we know that this one in particular is one that has meaning as far as the historical meaning this actually happened in Yasharel. People were eating their children. People were warring against each other in their own homes. And there's also the spiritual implications and the spiritual bondage that gets passed down through this curse being manifested onto not just Yasharel, but the children of Yasharel. So we have to understand as children of Yasharel that there is a real curse that has been put on our people because of our disobedience, to where many of us are hostile towards those in our own home, hostile to our brothers, hostile to our sisters, hostile to our husbands and to our wives. Now, I want us to also keep in mind, though, there's also an agenda. So yes, there's a curse is being manifested. But by all means, a curse is not just something that lives on its own. Many times there are going to be actors and agents who actually go out of their way in order to ensure that these curses are happening. And because many of us are not covered by Yahuwah, because many of us have not died to our sins, died to ourself, our flesh, and been resurrected by the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit. And that's what is required, by the way, in order for you to truly be saved, to truly receive salvation. You have to die to yourself, die to your own will, die to what you want to do, and instead be a new creature who is living according according to what Yah wants you to do. So because many of us have not gone through that process, many of those who say that they follow Yahushua or Jesus have not gone through that process. Because of this reality, these are the things that exist in many of our homes, exist in many of our relationships. So if we also understand that, as I said, there are aggressors who will target us, and if you're not covered by Yahusha, you can be a target. We have to also keep in mind that we have to be sharp. We have to be living according to the ways of Yah. We have to be obedient to Yah. We have to stay within Him, because the second that you go outside of Him, then again, you are prey to your enemy. And I want you to remember this, because we're going to go to the story of when the children of Moab went after the children of Yasharel. And if you think about what happens in this scenario, you have Balaam, or Balaam, I think is the way to pronounce it, who is a prophet, right? And he was hired to put curses on Yasharel. Many of you might know the story. Every time he tried to curse Yasharel or wanted to curse them, Yah's like, you better not curse them. This is what you're going to say. It's a blessing, right? So he ends up blessing Yasharel. And because he didn't want to die and lose his life, he was obedient and followed Yah. But what we're not told in that specific story is that later on, Balaam actually goes back to the people who hired him to curse Yasharel, Moab. And he tells them, do you want to get those children of Yasharel to really not prosper? Do you want them to be disorganized? Do you want them to be insignificant? Get them to sin. Very simple. Get them to sin against Elohim. Get them to sin against Yahuwah, because in sin, they are not that chosen anymore. In sin, they are not that given that protective status. So that's all you have to do. Get them to trip up, and then you can do what you want with them. Which is why, by the way, if you understand, again, who are the children of Yasharel? They're dispersed throughout the African diaspora. If you don't know that, I encourage you, watch this video, The Real Hebrews According to the Bible. But which is why there's an intentional target to make us sin. Whether it's media, whether it's rap videos, whether it's BET, whether it's the club scene, there's really an intentional effort to make us the most morally depraved, because those who are our enemies knows that Yah will not tolerate us when we're operating inside of that flesh. He can't tolerate us. I mean, you remember what happened with Adam, that because Adam sinned, Yah could no longer dwell with him. So Adam was on his own at that point. I mean, Yah still looked after him, but he had distance between him. Similarly, Yah can't dwell with us if we're in these places of darkness. So that's why there's an extra effort to make sure that the children of Yasharel are living not just sinful, but living pure debauchery and rebellion. If you notice, if you watch the news, if you watch movies, if you watch all of the things that are targeted towards us, that's no accident. Why are all the liquor stores in the black neighborhoods? That's no accident. Why is the abortion clinics in the black neighborhoods? That's no accident. Our enemies want us to sin, because they know that if we get connected to our Elohim, if we get connected to our God, and we start following His ways, and we die to ourselves and are resurrected by His Spirit, that essentially we cannot be touched by their devices. We are living under His grace, under His authority, and it is only Him who will lead and guide our path instead of our enemy. So I want to read through that story very quickly. Numbers 25, 1-9. While Yasharel remained at Shittim, the people began to commit infidelity with the daughters of Moab, for they invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. So Yasharel became followers of Baal of Peor, and Yahuwah was angry with Yasharel. And Yahuwah said to Moses, take all the leaders of the people and execute them in broad daylight before Yahuwah, so that the fierce anger of Yahuwah may turn away from Yasharel. So Moses said to the judges of Yasharel, each of you kill his men who have become followers of Baal of Peor. Then behold, one of the sons of Yasharel came and brought to his relatives a Midianite woman, in the sight of Moses and the sight of the whole congregation of the sons of Yasharel, while they were weeping at the entrance of the tent of meeting. When Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, the priest, saw it, he rose up from the midst of the congregation and took his spear in his hand. And he went after the man of Yasharel into the inner room of the tent and pierced both of them, the man of Yasharel and the woman, through the abdomen. So the plague on the sons of Yasharel was brought to a halt, but those who died from the plague were 24,000 in number. So if you go through the early part of Deuteronomy 28, you get to read about all the blessings that Yasharel will have. However, because these people sinned against Yahuwah, they actually were receiving a curse. They were dealing with a plague. I want us to think about the different dynamics that were at play when we read this story. So again, you have the men of Yasharel, that's what we see mentioned, who have gone and poured themselves out with the daughters of the Moabites, right? So that's actually really important to keep in mind. Where were the women when the men abandoned their post and went into the neighboring communities and committed idolatry with the gods of those people and also fornication with their daughters, right? I often also wonder what type of psyche does that develop in a people where you will cling to the things of the world instead of the things that are holy. What type of psyche did that do to the women of Yasharel whenever they, who were actually the wives and the daughters, actually watched their men abandon post in order to go to other women of other cultures? What type of animosity does that bring into the household? So these are the things that get set up whenever what happened? The man abandons his post. So I am a absolute believer, and prayerfully you all can get a sense of this through what me and my husband do, but I'm actually absolute believer, and I stand on the fact that the man is the one who is the standard bearer or the standard layer inside of the home. He is the one who stands for Yah and has a post, and that post is very vital to the health and wealth of the entire family. So for that reason, woman, you are to submit to your husbands. That is something that is told in scripture, and there's a spiritual reason behind that, because the man is the one who is going to go out and be the representative, not only of himself, but of his family, even in the face of adversity. In this case scenario, because the man abandoned his post, the one who was supposed to be lifting up incense to Yahuwah was lifting up incense to false gods. Now we have invited into the community all types of calamity. It's not an insignificant thing to have a man who's going to stand on righteousness in his home in order to ward off enemies. Now, you might not believe this. You might have been indoctrinated by feminism, but I'm actually going to show you a real life example of why the men being at their post is such a threat to this world, such a threat to our enemies, and why there's this intentional effort to derail that setup, derail that order that Yah created inside of our homes, an intentional effort to remove a man from his post in order to cause chaos inside of the household. So let's go on, and actually we're going to read 1 Timothy 2. 1 Timothy 2, we're starting with verse 8. Therefore, I want the men in every place to pray, lifting up holy hands without anger and dispute. Likewise, I want women to adorn themselves with proper clothing, modestly and discreetly, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or expensive apparel, but rather by means of good works, as is proper for women, making a claim to godliness. A woman must quietly receive instruction with entire submissiveness. But I do not allow a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man, but to remain quiet. For it was Adam who was first created, and then Eve, and it was not Adam who was deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a wrongdoer. But women will be preserved through childbirth if they continue in faith, love, sanctity with moderation. So the question here is Paul creating a new law? Is he creating a law that women are not allowed to speak? And of course, the question has to be no, because Paul is not in a position to create law. Only Yahuwah is the one who creates law. So when Paul says, I do not allow a woman to teach or speak, they have to remain quiet, he is doing that inside of his congregation, obviously inside of a society that's regarded women as not being able to speak. I'm not casting judgment on that, obviously, because there is an order to things, and that's what Paul wanted us to understand. Because so many people get distracted about the woman should not speak part, they miss the overall picture. Paul is creating parameters in order to ensure that the men of the household are not going to abandon their post. So, for example, verse 1, I want every man in every place to pray, lifting up holy hands without anger and dispute. That is the man's post. The man is the covering of his entire household. He goes on to again say that women should quietly receive instruction in submissiveness. And yes, women, it is our job to submit to our spiritual covering. He says, I do not allow a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man, but to be quiet. For it was Adam who was first created, and then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived. What happened in the story of Adam and Eve is very important if you're trying to understand this whole scenario, because Adam was created first. Adam was the husband, Eve was the wife, she was his helpmate. But Eve went out and did something without being a help to her husband. Instead, she brought something to her husband that he knew was wrong. And instead of putting her in the proper place, instead of correcting her, he listened to her. Okay. So what is that telling us? That is that when men are not standing in place of righteousness and standing in a place of order within the kingdom of Yahuwah, that they can allow their women to literally remove from them their covering, remove from them their purpose, remove from them their voice. That is a danger to this society. And that's just the reality. Men who are standing righteously on principle is always going to be a danger to this society. Genesis 3:8-13. Now they heard the sound of Yahuwah, Elohim, walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of Yahuwah, Elohim, among the trees of the garden. Then Yahuwah called to the man and said to him, Where are you? He said, I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid myself. And he said, Who told you you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree from which I commanded you not to eat? The man said, The woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me some of the fruit of the tree, and I ate it. Then Yahuwah said, What have you done? The woman said that the serpent deceived her. The serpent deceived me, and I ate. So what did the serpent do to cause calamity inside of Yah's kingdom? Because his kingdom on earth is being established through Adam. To cause that calamity, he gives the woman a position of authority and has the woman deceived. And the woman, instead of following her husband, she gets her husband to follow him, which is emasculation. I mean, a man abandoning his post, particularly in righteousness, because let me be very clear, there are times when women have to make decisions that go contrary to the man. If you are married to someone who's not in Yah's way, who's not following Yahuwah, and they are trying to make you do something or make your children do something that goes against Yah, there are times where women have had to go contrary to their husband. But we're talking about a household established in the holiness of Yahuwah, a household that is in order, in the order of Yahuwah. What does the serpent do? He gets the woman to lead the man. Not inside of a righteous direction either, but against Yah's commandments. This is, again, emasculation of the man. And that's really what we're going to be getting into today, because we're going to talk about how this modern emasculation of the man inside of the household, how this has been the fulfillment not only of the curse inside of our community, but this has been the cause of our vulnerability to all of our enemies. This whole idea that the woman is sufficient on her own to be her own covering is one that has robbed many women of their effectiveness, has robbed many women of their ability to stand on righteousness has robbed many women of the ability to parent correctly. Because at the end of the day, we have to understand that Yah does have an order to things. And while we have a place, we're not unequal. Yah is very clear. He's not a respecter of persons. The woman is not unequal, but the woman's place is not to be the covering over the man. So consider this verse in Deuteronomy 23, 1-2. No one who has been emasculated by crushing or cutting may enter the assembly of Yahuwah. No one born of a forbidden marriage, nor any other descendants may enter the assembly of Yahuwah, not even in the 10th generation. Also consider verse 17. No Israelite man or woman is to become a shrine prostitute. You must not bring the earrings of a female prostitute or of a male prostitute into the house of Yahuwah, your Elohim, and pay any vow, because Yahuwah, your Elohim, detests them both. Few things in the scripture. So we know that there are things that are happening in the physical, but there's also a spiritual ramification. So the castration of a man who has been castrated, it says emasculated. The castration of a man also has a spiritual component to it. Similarly, you can castrate a man in the spiritual, even if you don't do it inside of the physical. If you are, again, out of Yahuwah's order. We have a lot of men who have not taken back that position inside of the kingdom because they have allowed themselves to be castrated, for lack of a better word. I'm sorry if this is a vulgar teaching we're doing today, but this is what we're being taught. There's a physical thing that's happening. A man who has been castrated is not able to enter the assembly. There's a spiritual component, obviously, to this physical act, because any man who is allowing the woman to be the head of the household, any man who's allowing the woman to cover him spiritually, has immaculated himself spiritually. So consider this also. What would the enemy want to do if he wanted to actually affect negative things inside of our community? He would have to, on a mass scale, emasculate the man. He would have to make them feel powerless over his own household, powerless in his own family. He would have to make his voice insignificant and elevate that of the woman. Many of us have experienced this. Many of us experienced this in this Babylonian society. All of us have received the Porsche, the ideological Porsche, in order to silence the voice of the man, in order to elevate the voice of the woman. Think about the whole Me Too movement. People saying just believe her and don't even consider what he's saying. That's literal emasculation. Literally, we don't care what he says. We only believe her. We're going to go with that narrative. And certainly, I'm not making any excuses for any type of foul behavior. But the implications of this, believe her, honor what she says, and disregard what he says. That is societal emasculation. So we're going back to the kingdom. We're going back to Yah's kingdom. And we're understanding that, again, the man does have a post, just as the woman has a post. The man has a post as the one who's fighting the battle, and the woman has a post as the one who's his backup, particularly when we're talking about spiritual things, praying, seeking Yah, spending time in meditation, teaching the children to do the same. These are how we are supposed to function inside of this world. By no means are we supposed to be going out in front of the man in order to fight spiritual battles. But what does the enemy want? He wants us in that positioning, because this out of order arrangement allows us to be most vulnerable. Now, let me say really quickly, I know many of our women who are in the way, many of our women who follow the ways of Yahusha are coming out of this system, but they might not have spouses who are there. They could be a good spouse, but maybe they're not there spiritually yet. What are we to do in that situation? Obviously, we continue to pray for those, particularly your spouse, if they have not had their eyes open. But we also know that Yah is very well aware of all of our needs. So when we submit to our husbands, even if they're not following Yah's way, and again, when I say submit, I'm not talking about if they're directing you to do something that goes against Yahuwah. By all means, do not submit to anything that goes against him. But in general, when you're submitting to your husband, but you're also doing it as a work of service to Yahuwah. Not only does he see what you're going through, but Yah, because you're ultimately submitting to him by submitting to your husband, Yah will step in order to navigate you spiritually, so that even as you do work for this person that might not believe or might not have their eyes open because of your service to the kingdom and your faithfulness to Yahuwah, Yahuwah is very well going to be your lead and your guide and your covering inside of this arrangement. So I want us to go forward and talk about the Arab slave trade, because many of you don't know, as I said, our enemies have recognized that this is a way to cause dysfunction and disorder amongst our people and our communities. Our enemies have recognized that this is a way to have the sons and daughters of Yasharel completely running amok, completely living in sin, prostituting themselves, as the scripture said, excelling themselves from Yah's assembly. The enemy has picked up on this. The enemy knows this trick, and he has mastered it at this point. That is why whenever you look at our families, particularly those of us who actually reside in Babylon, I know this is for some reason when you're living with the oppressor, it just is worse. Particularly those of us who are in Babylon, in America, in Europe, in places that are the empires of the Babylon Empire, you see that occurrence so much worse, to where literally you will have complete dysfunction. So the enemy does this again in order to upset the whole order of things, in order to make the children rebel. Because if you're a child rebelling against your parent, you will more easily rebel against the Most High. If you're a woman who's not submitting herself to her husband, and obviously if you're single, you don't have a husband, but who do you submit yourself to? You submit yourself to Yahuwah. But if I'm not submitting myself to my husband, how am I also to submit myself to Yahuwah? Yahuwah has told me as a woman that I am to submit myself to my husband as an act of service, an act of duty unto him. So if I then refuse to do that to my husband, and then I go to Yahuwah to approach him, I'm already living in rebellion. So you see how this thing being out of order creates chaos for all of us, creates fatherless homes, creates iniquity, creates havoc, violence, all of these things because of the spiritual lead of the household. The spiritual post of the man has been removed from many of our homes. So the Arabs recognized this very early on. And if you don't know, they conducted the Arab slave trade inside of East Africa, okay? So we all know the transatlantic slave trade. That's the one that most people talk about. But we don't know that there was a slave trade, many of us, before the transatlantic slave trade. And it's actually a very important slave trade because the Arab slave trade actually inspired so many of the things inside of the transatlantic slave trade. This transatlantic slave trade would not have happened if it were not for the Arab slave trade. Now, we don't know the numbers of the Arab slave trade. They weren't just as much as the transatlantic, but it was still a significant amount of Africans being taken out of particularly Eastern Africa. Now, we know, if you follow this channel, you know already that the true land of Yasharel is not that place in Palestine. It's actually inside of East Africa, the Ethiopia, Sudan, Eritrea, Djibouti. That is the region that was biblical Yasharel. If you do not know that, I have a documentary, Israel Uncovered. Please click the link. I'm going to post it below and also post it here, post a tag here. Watch the documentary. Do not debate this on this video. Debate it over there by all means. I'm fine with debate, but let's not derail one conversation and try to bring it over into a different subject. But if you are not aware, if you have not watched that documentary, definitely watch it, because I believe it's like not even a debate, but some people will watch the documentary and still want to debate things, and that's fine. So that is actually where the East African slave trade, the Arab slave trade, happened, inside of East Africa. Oh, what a coincidence that the literal place where Yasharel was, that was the place where the first international slave trade of its kind happened. What a coincidence also that the people who were the primary target of the Arab slave trade are people who I proved inside of my book. My book is Conspiracy to Erase a Nation, available on Amazon. If you're not able to afford it, you can send an email to AfrikanExodus@gmail.com explaining that you're not able to afford it, and I will send you a free copy. But as I break down and prove inside of my book, the Oromo people, as far as the different tribes inside of Ethiopia, that is one of the tribes that is actually Hebrew, okay? Don't debate that here because it's not the subject of this video. I do have a video on it, though, and I will post it down below as well. So these are the people who become the targets of the Arab slave trade. Particularly Oromo women were sought after by the Arabs. They wanted them to be concubines. The interesting thing that was different from the the Arab slave trade from the West African slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade, is that the men were pretty much always castrated. They castrated the men, and then the women they took to be concubines because for some reason, particularly those Oromo women that they would kidnap, they said they were so sexually pleasing to the Arabs, and so they wanted them as their concubines. The men, though, they didn't want them. They didn't want them to reproduce either. They instead decided to castrate them. So let's investigate why. We're going to read from first article. This is just a very quick slide. I want you to just read this description. This is from David Gakunzi, and he says the Arab slave trade was characterized by appalling violence, castration, and rape. The men were systematically castrated to prevent them from reproducing and being a stock. This inhumane practice resulted in a high death rate. 6 out of 10 people who were mutilated died from their wounds in castration centers. The Arab slave trade also targeted African women and girls who were captured and deported for use as sex slaves. Going forward, this is from the New the New African magazine. It says, while in Europe, the New World, the measure of a man's stature was mapped out and calibrated on his physical dimensions of empire built upon the sinews of forced masculine labor. In the Islamic Orient, wealth was a reflection of prestige. Young girls, the vessel of male hubris. The mats of male pleasure ground. The malleable material to be shaped to the master's will. Thus, women slaves in the Arab world were often turned into concubines, living in harems, and rarely as wives, their children becoming free. A large number of male slaves and young boys were castrated and turned into eunuchs who kept watch over the harems. Castration was particularly brutal operation with a survival rate of only 10%. The combined effect of all of these factors, says Duncan Clark, was a steady demand for slaves throughout the Islamic world, which had cover story to be met from wars, raids, or purchases along the borders with non-Islamic regions. Although some of these slaves came from Russia, the Balkans, and Central Asia, the continuing expansion of Islamic regimes into sub-Saharan Africa made Black Africans the major source. So invasive was the practice of slavery into the economic, political, demographic, cultural, social, and religious life of Africa and persisted for so many centuries that while its effect varied both geographically and temporally in intensity, slavery outdistances in scale and scope any single or a combination of disasters, natural or man-made, which descended upon the continent. So we're going to go through this article. You can see right here, this man is horribly castrated. But we're going to read from this article. It says, the castration of African slaves became a common practice as early as the 15th century and continued several centuries. These castrated slaves were highly sought after and considered the most expensive, primarily due to the belief that they would work better and pose no threat to the wives and concubines of their owners. This horrific practice was also meant to dehumanize the slaves, reinforcing the notion that they were commodities rather than human beings. It's important to note that Islam strictly forbade castration. However, slavers found ways to circumvent this prohibition. One approach was to purchase already castrated slaves, while another involved employing non-Muslims to perform the operation. The castration process typically involved the removal of just the testicles, although in some cases it was more extreme, with the penis and testicles being removed. Boys were often subjected to this horrific procedure around the ages of 8 or 9, and it was believed that they could survive it more easily than adults or adolescents. Nevertheless, the mortality rate among eunuchs remained high, making them the most expensive and prized slave due to the risk involved in the procurement. Also, their inability to have children meant they were less likely to attempt to seize power and establish a dynasty, making them more reliable in the eyes of the ruling elite. This is so deep. It goes on to say their duties range from being guards and caretakers of mosques to administrators and dancers known as, not sure how to pronounce this, young coquettes, I think. Their the young Kokeks began their training around the age of 7 or 8 following circumcision and typically took about 6 years to become accomplished in their art. These dances were described as sensuous, attractive, and effeminate, with their performances being sexually provocative. So several things I want to know about these readings. Number one, you notice that they castrated the man in order to make sure that he posed no problem or no threat to their power. And similarly, whenever you have spiritual castration of the man in the household, whenever you have no spiritual head inside of the household, that is for this reason that the enemy does that, because they want you to have no power. They want for the woman to pose no threat to them. They want for the children to pose no threat to them. And certainly any man who is spiritually castrated will pose no threat to the enemy. Similarly, you also see that they actually had the men who were watching the women who were being raped. So literally, these are men who were castrated, who were watching their woman being raped, looking after, being guards of the centers where these rapes were happening. This is also going further towards that spiritual castration that they want to happen. They want you to pose not only no threat to them, but they want to remind you that you are not the man in this scenario. Let it not be lost on us that, as it's implied inside of the article, there was also an effeminate trait that would come from the men who were castrated. They would have them doing these shows for them in order to do things that were sexually provocative for their audiences. So they were paraded around like this, these men, in effeminate ways. What else is the result of not having the spiritual head in position and at his post? What do we see all throughout the African community, particularly in the West, but trying to make its way into places like Africa? We see a lot of not just effeminate men, but we see a lot of homosexuality. We see a lot of this trans thing growing. It's just no coincidence. Whenever you actually hear the stories of people who are inside of that lifestyle, so many times there's trauma with the man. There's no man in the home, or there's something wrong happened with the man who was in the home. Certainly he was not at the correct spiritual post. So I think what I want us to understand, or perfectly what you do understand, is that these curses also have people who are pushing them in order to continue them. They don't want us to wake up, obviously. Our enemies don't want us to wake up to the truth. Our enemies want us to stay inside of this place of being spiritually handicapped. So they reinforce the things that they've told us. They reinforce the sinfulness. They reinforce the iniquity in order to keep us in this bind. But what we have the responsibility of doing is actively, first of all, again, dying to ourselves, being reborn into the spirit, allowing Yah to be the one who leads us in our families, inside of our relationships, inside of our marriages, in order to set things in the proper order. Because I promise you, if you truly do die to your flesh, you will by its nature submit to your husband. You will by its nature as a man assume the position of being the spiritual covering. You will by its nature be the priest of your household. But again, what has to happen first? We have to abandon the life of this worldly community around us. We have to abandon that in order to live a kingdom lifestyle, a lifestyle where we're moving by the spirit. We're not moving by the flesh, because moving by the flesh is moving against the order that Yahuwah created. So the thing is, I want everyone to understand there is, again, a spiritual enemy who tries to get us inside of these compromising positions, but it is our responsibility to reassert the truth, reassert order, reassert things the way that they should be. That is, by all means, we have to push for a family dynamic where the man is at his post, the woman is at her post, and also the children are growing up inside of an environment that is spiritually fruitful for them, if we are going to defeat this enemy and root him out of our family line and root him out of our communities. So that's all I have for this video. I thank you all for watching. Yah willing, I'll see you all in the next video.
We are not Africans. All right. We are possessed by spirits and demons. We have let another people's spirit take possession of our bodies and take possession of our minds. When we speak, it is not with our African voice. It is with the voice of that demonic presence that uses our lips to speak its own language. Yes. Yes, and we have to recognize this. We are possessed. And if we are to transform ourselves and to transform that the nature of our relationship with those who are our masters, we must engage in an exorcism and clear the devils out of our minds. And at this time, then, it'll pay you to read a little bit about demonic possession. And we have to be demonically possessed. Because if we talk about black-on-black violence, self-defeating behavior, self-destructive behavior, then we could not be possessed by a beautiful and wonderful God. We must be possessed by a demon. It's interesting to look at the literature on possession. We have a couple of types of possession. One is called a somnambulistic possession. Somnambulistic. Soma, in this instance, having to do with sleep. You hear it in the word sominex. Ambulistic, to move around. Ambulatory, right? So we're talking about people who are what? Sleepwalking. They're not awake, but they're walking around. The body is moving and it is walking in an organized fashion and walking systematically, but the person is still asleep. And in somnambulistic possession, then, the individual's original self has been repressed and displaced, and he identifies with the spirit that possesses him. And his I and the spirit's I are one and the same. And we have a lot of that here today, where the spirit that has been implanted in us, we have taken to be us, and we've identified with it. That is why in defending ourselves, we end up defending the people who rule over us. In defending our ego, we end up maintaining the social structure that has destroyed our ego to begin with. And you see it in our youngsters, who will fight and kill in the name of respect, and fight because their egotistic orientation has been insulted. And therefore, in defending their ego, they do not kill the people who destroyed their ego. They kill each other and maintain the ones who destroyed them in the first place in power. And that's why the subtitle of my book, Black on Black Violence, was Black Self-Annihilation in Service of White Domination. We are killing each other in order to maintain this system. We have let ourselves become possessed by a spirit such that when we become aggressive, we aggress against the self instead of those who are the source of our aggressive orientation.